This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we explore history we never learned in school through the books we never read in school, but wish we had and should have. I'm Rochelle Chase, a columnist and author of Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa, along with 8 other books and novellas. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe at rochellechase.substack.com for the latest episodes and other news. In this episode, I'm discussing Last Seen, the enduring search by formerly enslaved people to find their lost families by Dr. Judith Giesberg. And my guest today is Dr. Giesberg. Last Seen follows 10 individuals as they search for family and friends from whom they were separated during America's domestic slave trade. But in detailing these individual stories, Dr. Giesberg packs a ton of history. Listen in as we discuss the resilience and determination of formerly enslaved people in their search for their families, despite the many obstacles they faced, the challenges formerly enslaved veterans faced in proving their service and injuries to qualify for pensions, the impact of family separation on children, and here's a horrific fact, 30% of nearly 4 million enslaved Americans were younger than 10 when the Civil War began, and more. A little about Dr. Giesberg. Judith Giesberg holds the Robert M. Birmingham Chair in the Humanities and is professor of history at Villanova University. Her prior books include Sex and the Civil War, Soldiers, Pornography, and the Making of Modern Morality, Emily Davis's Civil War, The Diaries of a Free Black Woman in Philadelphia, 1863 to 1865, Army at Home, Women and the Civil War on the Northern Home Front, and Civil War Sisterhood, the United States Sanitary Commission and Women's Politics in Transition. In addition to her book, Last Seen, the enduring search by formerly enslaved people to find their lost families, which we're discussing today, Dr. Giesberg directs a digital project, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, that is collecting, digitizing, and transcribing the information on wanted ads into a searchable database accessible for free at informationwanted.org. Now, let's start reading with Rochelle. Dr. Giesberg, welcome to Reading with Rochelle.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I was looking forward to your book. It's Last Seen, the enduring search by formerly enslaved people to find their lost families. And when I got your book, I did get an advance review copy. I thought, okay, I would read a book about the search that people had for their families. But what was also really fascinating is you wove so much history into not only the people's lives that you were profiling, but also what was going on in that time period, like some of the men that would have been fighting in the Army on the Union side, what they were experiencing, the struggle for pensions. I mean, there was just so much history also woven in here. And a lot of it was horrifying. I really enjoyed it. Not only the stories that you chose of the people that were seeking their families and the advertisements, but also all that history that you wove into it as well.
Their stories really show us all the different sort of the aspects of the members of Freedom Generations, their lives. The thing that runs through them is they're all searching for family and kin in the aftermath of the war. But each of their searches is unique to them personally and also sort of unique geographically, depending on who they're searching for.
And I guess that's a nice segue into just taking a step backwards and having you explain in your words what your book is about for those who may not have read it yet.
Sure. The book is based on an archive of about 5,000 information wanted lost friends advertisements taken out by formerly enslaved people in the aftermath of the Civil War. The book then follows 10 individuals as they search for the family and friends from whom they were separated during America's domestic slave trade. So each of the chapters begins with the advertisement that the person placed in the newspaper and then follows their story backward to find out the circumstances under which they were separated from their loved ones, and then forwards as it follows them as they're searching for their loved ones, and then to see if we can find evidence that they found one another. Other people's stories are woven in so that readers can think through the unique challenges of mothers searching for their children, children looking for their parents, and the sort of other kinds of searches that you find in the book. I make an appeal in the book for us to think about this experience as something that connected members of Freedom Generation, that is, enslaved people who came free either during the war or immediately before it, and then spent years afterward trying to find the family from whom they had been separated.
I was amazed that you were able to find so much information about these people's lives from that one little ad that might have mentioned different aspects of maybe who they had been enslaved by, when they were sold, where they moved next. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about how did you piece some of that together? Maybe take one of the stories, maybe one that was memorable to you or stood out to you the most, and talk a little bit about that story and how you piece together the life of that person.
Sure. Some of the people who you'll meet in the book left more of a paper trail than did others. For instance, there is a story about a man who was separated from his mother when he was a young child, and his name was Henry Tibbs. And he posted one advertisement looking for his mother, and he was in his 50s when he did, and he placed one advertisement for her. That was my entry into his story. And then I started with the information that he gives us in his advertisement about when and where he had last seen his mother and the circumstances surrounding his separation. So I started there and found him in the records right where he said he was living in the advertisement. These advertisements are, like you said, very short. In most cases, they have just the bare bones information. But they do locate people in time and place, which is a great start. So when I could find him right where he said he was living in the census, then I knew that I could potentially follow him through other records. And your listeners know enslaved people are not recorded in federal records as individuals, they're recorded as property. So I knew in all of these cases, I would have to find them in a post-war census so that I could anchor them in a time and place, and then trace the story that he gives in the advertisements as well as I could through the records, knowing that it's more likely, in Henry Tibbs' case, he names an enslaver. It's more likely in all of their cases that you would be able to find an enslaver in the records before 1870. And in Tibbs' case, I did. So I could sketch out where he lived and who was responsible for selling this young boy away from his mother, and begin to tell a story about this one man. And then in Tibbs's case, too, not only was I able to find him in a census after the war, but I also found him in the military records because he enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. So I could find out what his wartime experience was, and I could find him after the war through his pension application, and I could find out more about what his life was like. So for Tibbs, the advertisement was the start, and it pointed me in a direction that I could follow to go backward, and then I could also go forward with him too. But it was just one advertisement, but I was able to find him in a lot of other federal records. Other people left a lot of advertisements. Diana Johnson winds up in Goliad, Texas, which is a teeny town right on the border of South Texas. And she placed a bunch of ads all over the place from her property. She was a property owner in South Texas, and she tried to find family members from the East from whom she had been sold away. Also, again, when she was quite young. But she left a giant sort of paper trail in hopes that she would find some of these people from whom she'd been separated quite a number of years ago. And plus, she was a property owner, so she was in and out of the courthouse all the time, registering things, sales of property and purchases of property. So she was her archive was considerable. And she published ads in a lot of Black newspapers. She then wrote to city officials in the Midwest trying to find family members. She was a very determined searcher, and she left a lot of records, and each one of them was a little different. So every time she'd write to the papers, you'd get another little fragment and learn more about her family. So she also enlisted the help of a daughter, for instance, in helping her write some of these letters. So her story started with this sort of the opposite end. There were a lot of different advertisements that I had to sift through to try to know where to start with her. Whereas Henry Tibbs, it was very clear where to start and where to go next.
Yeah, her story was really fascinating to me. The fact that she had owned so much land, and I believe she was single, wasn't she, for a large percentage of that time?
Yes, the deeds were in her name. There's no record of any husband involved in any of these transactions. There is one moment in a census where she's enumerated as a widow, but that's the only evidence of marriage.
And before I move on to the other question, I do want to ask you, was there one story that really stood out for you for some reason? They're all different, and they all illustrate like a different point, be it searching for children or a spouse, or just the extent of the search, or whether they actually found someone. They're all very different. But was there one that stood out for you in your mind for some reason?
It's hard for me to choose one that stands out, but Clara Bashop's story is particularly evocative of one of the themes of the book, which is to think about this phenomenon as being very much as creating an archive, right? I mean, often people have said or have claimed that it's difficult to write a history of slavery because enslaved people didn't leave records. On the other hand, as outgoing president of the American Historical Association, Thebolia Glimpse said just in her address just a few weeks ago, we have evidence of what is a very loud and rambunctious archive, that we find actually lots of records. And, this generation did create this archive for us for their own purposes, for them to find their family members, and then as historians, or it just interested people, genealogists, for us to know more about them and to know their history. And when you read Clara Bashop's chapter in the book, you get a sense of the variety of ways in which her search was documented in the archive. She's not like Diana Johnson, just plastering the papers with advertisements. She places a couple of advertisements on her own in Black newspapers, and she's clearly looking through the medium of Black newspapers to find her family. She winds up, on the other hand, being a feature in a white newspaper, and they write a human interest story about her that is then published in New York, in the Midwest, and then published on the West Coast because it gets copied into these big white newspapers. And it allows us to see the contrast between the stories that the Freedom Generation is telling about their lives in the Black press versus what white Americans are hearing about formerly enslaved people in their newspapers. And her story allows us to do that because you've got both her very succinct advertisements looking for her children, and then this big story that made national news about her search, which seemed to really, be serving a very different purpose, really more about forgetting than it was about remembering, versus Bashop's advertisements, which were about remembering, about setting the record straight, and about trying to find her children.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because you have made that point numerous times throughout the book, this difference. And you tie that into this whole lost narrative or lost cause narrative that it seems like the white papers were intent on really kind of showcases. And they weren't really interested in like the struggle. It was like this glossing over of slavery to write this happily ever after that. Oh, slavery's not that bad. See, a lot of families weren't separated. Look at this. These people have found each other. So there was not only this romanticized version, nostalgic version of these ads, but you also plainly show that there are a lot of racist undertones to them, And so I think you make that very clear, why that was the case. Can you talk a little bit more about how this lost cause narrative came into those ads? And not only in the ads, it seems like you talked a little bit about in other instances where we see that lost cause narrative coming up in these stories. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. The white newspapers, the timing of their sort of coverage of these of separated families is different and briefer. The advertisements in our archive, in the Last Seen archive, really date from 1865. There are some that are a little earlier, all the way to 1920. We're still seeing advertisers, formerly enslaved people, looking for their family members in these short, very information-rich, get right to the point kind of advertisements. And so those are the vast majority of the archive. But around the 1880s, last couple of decades of the 19th century, there appeared a number of stories that described the oftentimes surprise stories about formerly enslaved people who find one another and live happily ever after. And there were quite a number of them, and they lasted for maybe 10 or 20 years or so. You would see these stories. They read very differently, like you described them. They're highly romanticized. They're also very racist, dismissive. Oftentimes, the information that they provide about individuals doesn't even convince us that they might even be. We're not entirely clear they're actually talking about a particular individual because they don't give us either any name at all, or just a first name or a racist diminutive kind of term to describe people. So these were very different phenomenon, these stories that were told in the white newspaper. And they clearly were intended to take slavery and empty it of any meaning, the history of slavery, empty it of any meaning, right? This was about forgetting that slavery had caused the war, telling a story about slavery, as you said, as not really being all that bad, right? That people find each other again, and really it's time to just move on and forget about that past and let bygones be bygones, and let's forget that there was this whole war and there was a right side of the war and a wrong side of the war. And you can really see that operating in these white newspaper stories, and also in this phenomenon of telling stories of Enoch Arden, this Tennyson poem about a husband who returns to his wife and discovers that she's remarried, and then this sort of fraught way in which they try to sort out these multiple marriages. That became a phenomenon in the white paper too, where they like to characterize scorned freedmen who were husbands who came back to discover their wives were remarried. And it became this kind of comic way of dismissing what had been incredible violence done to enslaved people's marriages and families. So that's the sort of narrative that's being told in the white newspapers. But it also creeps into the way even the descendants of abolitionists are talking about slavery. There's one chapter that takes place in Battle Creek, Michigan, which was a hotbed of abolitionist activity and a super important stop on the Underground Railroad. And even in their stories that they're telling in that newspaper about these sisters who found each other again in Battle Creek, they're telling a story that makes the sort of institution of slavery, again, be emptied of meaning, and also just make their generation, the inheritors of abolitionists, feel sort of less responsible for any of the long after effects of slavery, that they can forget about that they can move on. There's no more work to be done in correcting this great wrong.
I hadn't heard of the Tennyson poem. You used that, I think, really effectively to show the difference also, that when it was applied to white characters, it was romanticized versus now making it this kind of a mockery when it's applied to Black people.
I actually hadn't heard of that Tennyson poem either until I started seeing these stories in the white press. And then I started investigating and discovered this wildly popular poem, I guess, in both the UK and the United States, about a mariner who's a poor man, and he leaves his wife behind to become a member of a ship, on board of a ship. The ship gets shipwrecked, and he's gone for a decade. And in the meantime, his wife and children are barely eking out a living, barely staying alive in his absence. And his wife holds on to the hope that he'll come home, and eventually his best friend, who's been supporting her, marries her and saves her, and they form a life together. When he comes back, of course, he is still alive. When he finally makes his way back to her, he watches her from afar. She doesn't know he's there. She doesn't recognize him. And then the tragedy is he never reveals himself to her, and he dies alone. And it's this tragic story about a bad thing that can happen to good people. He's a very noble character. She's a very noble character, and even the second husband is a noble character. There's nobody who's comic. There's nobody who's bad or means ill. When newspapers began to report on what they called colored Enoch Ardens, it was all as a way to lampoon Black family life, to take these very complicated, entangled relationships that resulted from marriages being repeatedly separated in slavery, the violence done to these marriages, and then turn it into something that readers would use to condemn freed people's morals, that somehow they had emerged from slavery not understanding how to be moral people. And it was a way to talk about how, right, under slavery, their enslavers monitored and mandated a certain kind of morality. And in freedom, clearly freed people, right, suffered from a lack of that kind of oversight. And it was really complicated that a lot of former slave states passed these laws that legalized freed people's marriages. But in the process, they also defined marriage in a way that didn't include the very complex relationships that resulted from those separations. So freed people are sometimes blending families in the aftermath of slavery. Even during slavery, they're finding ways to survive the disruptions that slavery wrought on their families. The resulting families didn't fit into these sort of new legalized marriages or legalized families. So you might actually have a family made up of multiple spouses and children from various marriages, because that's the way that enslaved people survived, and that was the way it made the most sense to continue to survive in the aftermath of the war. But the way that it was portrayed in white newspapers was meant as a condemnation of freed people, not as a condemnation of the slave trade.
I think you also mentioned, when we're talking about acknowledging these marriages of formerly enslaved people, now it's also then being used not only to ridicule them as it relates to their morals and et cetera, but also now it's against the law, right? Now they are bigamists, and now we can actually put them in jail or put them in a convict leasing system. So now they're going to have to work, in a sense, going back to slavery. So then that was another point that you brought to light of how this was used against them.
Yes. Tara Hunter, scholars written extensively about Black family life. And she makes this point in her book that I think really explodes this notion of that now we are free to marry. What did it mean to be free to marry in states that mandated, that criminalized any practices that fell outside of this very narrow definition of marriage? So that also then shapes the way we see these records appear in this archive. So it was more likely for husbands to search for their wives. It's in the archive, at least, that's what we're seeing, than wives to search for their husbands. Wives were less likely. In our archive, at least, we found fewer of them searching for husbands than it is for husbands searching for wives. And even so, even just the sort of spouses looking for each other is less common than some of the other searches. And you can see why, because of the reasons you described, because so many different practices that had allowed enslaved people to survive slavery now were criminalized. And so if one sort of announces in the newspaper a marriage that was now defined as irregular, bigamy or polygamy or whatever was now outlined through these state laws, then one was potentially bringing unwarranted attention on Black families.
I wanted to just switch gears for a minute. First of all, you had some horrifying statistics about children. We're talking about splitting up families. I think you had mentioned 30% of nearly 4 million enslaved Americans were younger than 10 when the Civil War began. So this also puts some numbers around just how that splitting up of children from their parents, how prevalent that was. And then that you can also see a lot of those ads seem to be a lot of parents looking for their children, trying to find them. So that really brought that to light when you threw in some of those statistics. Were you surprised by some of these statistics that you wove throughout, either related to children or related to some of the other things that you found?
Yeah, the number of children who were sold from the East Coast out into the Mississippi Valley is those numbers are by themselves it is shocking. And like everybody else, when I first read those, and that was years ago in work done by people like Walter Johnson and Ed Baptist, have put the numbers on these kinds of sales. It's shocking. It really is. Everything about the institution is shocking. The selling of children, the sort of common phenomenon of the selling of children, is really quite shocking. And enslaved people, the slavers often, of course, denied that this ever happened. There were actually laws in place in Virginia against selling a child away from their mother. But there were so many loopholes in laws like that protected children that they might as well have existed. On the other hand, in their narratives, formerly enslaved people who escaped slavery and then wrote their narratives, they talk about it being very common. They describe slave auctions where children were sold away from their mothers, and that runs through all the narratives written by formerly enslaved people. Abolitionists always included sketches of this kind of thing and talked about this as being very common. There's this sort of official line story about how this didn't happen and there were laws prohibiting it. And then there's the real eyewitness accounts that talk about this being so common that everybody seemed to include a story like that in their narratives or in their publications about slavery. And following that thread through this book, the advertisements taken out by formerly enslaved people who were separated from their mothers or fathers when they were quite young are very hard to read. These are people who, like Henry Tibbs is one of them, and I mentioned him before. He was separated from his mother when he was a child. When he's in his late 50s, he's writing about her, and he's being transported back in time to that moment when he lost her. And parents in these advertisements written by now grown-up children take on these larger-than-life kinds of personas. Children remember the last time they saw their mother or father very vividly, and the way that the parents heroically tried to save them from being sold away. Tibbs' story, he describes his mother coming to him when he was being held in the slave jail and trying to help him be brave by bringing him candy and cake and trying to make him feel safe in what is otherwise an awful, unsafe position, but then also giving him this moment to remember her. And there are stories of fathers taking children across swollen creeks in the middle of awful storms to try to stop them from being sold away, a mother taking out a tooth from her own mouth and tying a string around it and tying it around her infant daughter's neck while her daughter's being sold away. So those stories of children vividly remembering their parents, bring those numbers to life and also give us a sense of how difficult it would be to search for people who you have these very vivid memories of, but you often don't have much else. Like, Tibbs doesn't know his mother's name was Hannah, but he doesn't know what her last name was. Mm-hmm. He gave us very little else. The year that he thought that he was separated from her doesn't quite coincide with what we know later about his birth. The memories are both vivid, but also blurry because we're talking about children and we're talking about this traumatic moment when they lost their loved ones and the way that they held on to that moment and then tried to put it down on a piece of paper later. The chapters that focus on people who were separated when they were quite young really bring home what those numbers that you mentioned, what that means and the long-term effects of that, what it meant for a child to suffer that trauma and what we know now about trauma and how that can affect your ability to create memories after that, and how children can miss milestones when they've suffered a trauma like that. It really does bring home the long effects of a family separation during slavery.
And I can't remember if Henry Tibbs, didn't you take his story a little bit further as he is sold and how that ended up affecting his relationship with how he interacted with other enslaved people in wanting to help them? Was that Henry Tibbs?
Yeah, so for Henry Tibbs, to try to sort of imagine how he gets from the East Coast, he comes from Virginia and then winds up in the Mississippi Valley. I use a lot of former slave narratives of people who were quite young when they traveled via the coffle to Mississippi or Louisiana or even Texas, and what that meant to have young children who were chained together in these coffles that were then force-marched into the interior. And we have from others who survived this experience stories of people helping each other on the coffle. Not always, right? Coffles could also be very tense places where people were desperately trying to save themselves, but we also have stories of young people helping each other or older people on the coffle helping the younger ones on the coffle. Yeah, and that's a story that I tell in his narrative.
Okay, one other thing about that came up quite a bit was you talked about pensions and some of the men who had fought in the Civil War, Black men being denied pensions, and the struggles and the challenges they had to go through and their spouses had to go through to prove that they were eligible for that. And I think Saffold, what was the first name? That one stands out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep, you were right. Henry Saffold's story is the story that you just described. He placed advertisements in both a Black newspaper and a white newspaper looking for other veterans from his U.S. colored troops, the troop that he was in during the Civil War, so the men with whom he fought during the Civil War. And that's a phenomenon that we see in these advertisements, both widows searching for information that they can use to help get pensions when their husbands have passed away and they need the documentation that was required, the very steep hill that they had to climb in order to qualify for pensions was littered with these requests for more paperwork. And Henry Saffold calls it the chain of evidence. He needed to prove to the Army that he was enlisted when he said he was enlisted. And that was a really difficult thing for formerly enslaved people to do. One, because you had to, just from the very beginning, you had to prove your age. And then like Henry Saffold said, he didn't know what his age was. Maybe it was kept in his former enslaver's Bible, because that's where white people had kept their information about their families. He didn't know where his age would have been recorded, so he couldn't produce that kind of evidence. He joined the United States Army when Sherman's men were marching through Georgia, and he didn't join officially. He wasn't enlisted officially, so he didn't even have enlistment records from the point at which he was put into the Army or he joined the Army. It was not entirely clear he went on his own volition or if he was simply impressed into the Army. And he was only officially enlisted months later. Not until the spring of 1865 was he actually officially enlisted. So he couldn't prove the two most basic things you had to prove in order to get a pension is how old were you and when were you enlisted. And so he placed an ad, like a lot of these men did, in the newspaper looking for people who could vouch for the information that could help him produce that chain of evidence that he needed in order to apply for a federal pension. So that's something that we see in these advertisements. They would even say in their advertisements, I had my enlistment papers, but now they're gone. They were stolen or they got destroyed. We know that there were opportunists in the post-war South who would take advantage of these elderly men, some of whom could read, some of them who couldn't read. And so there were lots of opportunities for you to be taken advantage of and for your pension papers to be lost or stolen, your discharge papers to be lost or stolen. And so they take to the papers looking for people who can help them. And Saffold does. He lists a number of men who were enlisted with him. And then looking into his pension files, there's evidence that they came forward with affidavits supporting his version of the events. He does wind up getting his pension. It's not enough, and it comes pretty late in his life. Mm-hmm. But for him, the advertisements that he places seem to work.
He's also proving that he sustained injuries while he was in the war, that they weren't just health issues, because it seemed like that was also used to deny these pensions. And so, again, you have these enslaved people who are coming in, as you mentioned in your book, who are coming in with these physical effects from slavery, all the abuse and treatment. So they're coming in with that, then it's being compounded. So they have to prove this. And that seems to surface a lot too, this constantly having, how do you prove these things as a formerly enslaved person, to your point?
Yes. Yeah. There's a great book I just read by an author named Dale Krutz, who studies the phenomenon that we were just talking about there, about how difficult it was for enslaved people, formerly enslaved men who were veterans now, to prove that their injuries as they grew older and the injuries that they sustained during the war got worse, or the way that they experienced them got worse, how difficult it was for them to prove that those injuries were sustained in the Army. And they had to do that. And as Dale Krutz says in his book, in doing so, they often, as they give these affidavits or they're being examined by these surgeons, they're often talking about how they, that in slavery they were perfectly healthy, which of course is the impossible position that they're being put in, is that they're having to sort of contribute to what other people will use to sustain the cover-up by saying that when I joined the Army, I was healthy. Of course, some of them were, but a lot of them weren't, because slavery was sustained on violence and deprivation. So these men came into the Army with health sometimes quite compromised from slavery, and then sustained other injuries and other illnesses, like in Saffold's case, from doing really the hard work that U.S. colored troops were often, they dug ditches, they built bridges, they did this hard work that put them in swamps and other places where they could get injured or ill. And so when they applied for their pensions, they had to walk this tightrope about what were the injuries that you sustained as a soldier, and what were the kinds of injuries that surgeons expected formerly enslaved men to have come into before they even joined the Army.
Yeah. I feel like I said, there was so much more that we barely touched, but what comes across as this constant resilience and the persistence of Black people, not only in trying to search for their loved ones, but of getting ahead of, despite all the limitations, the Black codes, you can't buy land, you can't rent land, but they're buying it. Or you're not supposed to read, but yet and still you had the statistics of 10% of Black people were literate somehow during enslavement. But my point is, you really highlight a lot of these struggles and a lot of these things that Black people were trying to achieve. And you point out some of the advantages that white people had, which I keep thinking to today, right? When we look at, again, it seems like there's always this fear that Black people are getting something they don't deserve, that they're giving this handout. And even in this book, when you're covering these horrible things are happening, there's still this belief that Black people, enslaved people, were getting some kind of an advantage that they shouldn't have. So that really struck me as well. Again, the parallels to today, but also how at that time you are saying these Black people who are fighting for everything and to get just what white people have been given, you're saying they still have this unfair advantage.
Yeah, and yet back to that point I was making earlier about what the president of the AHA said about that freed people didn't leave behind enough evidence for us to tell their stories. They did. Each one of these advertisements tells the story of resilience and of hope and determination to make sure that their story is preserved and is told. And that's what these advertisements do. They're a flare that they sent up to their descendants, for descendants to be able to find them, though, everywhere there was an attempt to erase this history. It resonates very much with the moment that we're in, that we're at a moment when Black history is now perceived as dangerous and somehow needs the sort of organized efforts on the part of the state to forget it, to cover it up. And I feel like it's very parallel to what this freedom generation was facing as they saw the rise of the lost cause. Yet they got their stories in the newspapers and sometimes all over the place. Like Diana Johnson, she just plastered it everywhere. And so in the end, they didn't succeed in erasing her story. Her story's there. And it is a story that is marked by the losses that she sustained in slavery. And it's also a story about the family that she built in this unlikely place on land that she wasn't supposed to have, and the ways that she carved out a full life for herself, even as she continued to hope to find more of her family that she left behind.
Well, I don't want to end this interview without talking about two more things. First of all, let's talk about your last scene, finally finding family after slavery, your database, which I think is at informationwanted.org, correct? So let's talk a little bit about that and how people can use that as well if they're searching for information.
Yes, the archive is free. And it, like you said, your listeners can access that at informationwanted.org. I started the archive in collaboration with a colleague of mine, a friend and colleague of mine at Mother Bethel Church here in Philadelphia. Margaret Gerardo, she's the archivist there. We started it in 2017 thinking we'd find a few hundred of these advertisements in one newspaper. And then as we talked about it with Black genealogy groups across the country, we realized that it was a much bigger archive. There was more out there that we could include in the archive, and we're now approaching 5,000 ads. We have 4,700 right now from about 300 different newspapers. We're constantly updating it. It has been built with the regular input and the collaboration of Black genealogists who have told us what they need in order to use it and how we can make it easier for people to find names and places and people in the archive. So users can search by first name, last name. They can search by geography, even if you're not sure, because names change in slavery. And then after slavery, we have a map where you can just hone in on a region where your family might be from in South Carolina, let's say, and you could just see all the different people who advertised from that place or who were from that place and were looking for family members there. So it's very flexible in the way that you can use it and use it to find people. So you can search by location, you can search by name, by of person or enslaver, you can search by newspaper. We're still working on it. We're funded by the National Archives. I hope we continue to be funded by the National Archives so we can continue to find these stories. From the very beginning, our aim was to make this stuff available for free. I first came across the advertisements when I was using a subscription database at my library at the college where I teach. And I saw these advertisements when I was reading the Christian Recorder, and I thought that the advertisements were fascinating, but they were also locked behind a paywall. Yeah. And there was clearly a whole other audience for these advertisements besides somebody sitting in a university university library. And so we find the advertisements on microfilm. We find the newspapers wherever we can find them. We borrow the microfilm. We digitize the advertisements and make them available for free. Everybody who does genealogy pays for way too many subscriptions, and this is not one of them. This is a free database that people use, and it is well used by genealogists. We have lots of people who are logging on, they're finding people, and we also collect some of those stories and post them on the site so people can see how people are using the archive.
And you've had more than 13 million visitors or so, right?
Yes.
The last question I want to ask you is, I hope people, first of all, will go and check that out. And do you want people, if they come across ads that aren't in there, would you want people to send those to you? Do you want people to help in that way as well?
Yes. This is not a giant operation. I and my collaborator at the University of Texas at Austin, Signe Formey, we are two people, and then we get federal funds that allow us to fund graduate students, just 2 graduate students who read a lot of microfilm, and not as fast as we'd like them to, but that's just the nature of microfilm. It's not, anybody who's used it knows it's not user-friendly. But we welcome and we encourage others who find even just one advertisement or a cache of advertisements to post that information, send us the information, and we'll find them. And we also invite people who use the website in to help us transcribe the advertisements so that they are then searchable through all those means that I described. From our small core of people, we can only do so much of it. But the reason it is where it is now is because we've gotten a lot of input from people who have found advertisements, who want to transcribe them, who want to share their stories. So when you go to informationwanted.org, you can tell us how you want to get involved. If it's somebody that you know in the archive, or if you know that there are some ads that we don't have there, let us know.
Okay, last question. So we've been talking about Last Seen, the enduring search by formerly enslaved people to find their lost families, your recent book. But you have a few other books that you've written as well. Do you want to just, before we end, just share a little bit about those books and where people can find more information about you and the books?
Sure. So when I first found the advertisements, I was actually working on a book called Army at Home, which looks at women in urban areas in the North and how they survived the dislocations of the Civil War and the deprivations of the Civil War. And so that book centers in a lot of urban areas. One of them is Philadelphia. That's where I was using the Christian Recorder and first started seeing these advertisements. So that book looks at how families survived when a husband or a son would enlist, and really how the war came home to communities like Philadelphia, Boston, like New York, like Chicago, how it was lived and survived in those areas. This project began there, but was put on a back burner while I finished that book. And then after that, I've had the great pleasure of working on projects that I can involve students in. And so after that one is a book that is a transcription of a diary kept by a free Black woman named Emily Davis, who lived in Philadelphia during the Civil War and kept this daily diary in which she talks about her life as both a student. She was going to school, and she was also working as a domestic, and she was commenting on what it meant to be a free Black woman, but to have this sort of shadow of living in a society in which slavery is still legal. And so she's commenting on her concerns about her father and brother who are in the way of the Confederate Army as they invade Pennsylvania. And so she allows us that raw kind of day-to-day feeling of what it meant to be a free Black woman during the Civil War era. And there are some diaries that they're just not as common as diaries kept by white women during the war. So Emily Davis's Civil War is the result of work that I involved students in. We read this diary, we transcribed it together, and we annotated it. We have it on a website at davisdiaries@villanova.edu. But teachers said, I like to use the website of the classroom, but I want the book. So we have the book too. So you can find that book as well. That was the first time I conceived of a project that we could do together. And there were a few others in between. And then the Last Seen project is really, as you said, is a collaboration between myself and my colleague, Dr. Formy from UT, archivists here in Philadelphia, Black genealogists everywhere who tell us where to go and what to do on the website, and also students at Villanova who sit at the microfilm reader and read a lot of microfilm books.
Your other books and projects sound really fascinating as well. I know where I'll be spending some time on those as well. I just got some information from an aunt about our family, so I did try to plug in some names just recently to see if I can find anything. So I'm looking forward to personally exploring your database a little bit more. And I hope people that are listening will as well. And I hope they will read your book, Last Seen, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families. I want to thank you so much for being on today. It has been great having this conversation. And if there's something else you want to add before we close, you can.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about this project and to make sure that we're remembering that there are a lot of stories that are yet to be told about this generation of freed people, and that this history is really everywhere. And as long as we keep telling these stories, there's little chance that it'll be erased, or less chance that it will be erased.
Thank you for listening to Reading with Rochelle. To learn more about my guest, Dr. Judith Giesberg, her book, Last Seen, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families, and the Last Seen searchable database, visit informationwanted.org. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support my podcast, please leave a rating and a review, plus subscribe at rochellechase.substack.com.